All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott. I've been talking JavaScript with you courtesy of Muroc's JavaScript 2nd edition text. We're toward the end of section 1 of the book. I'm on chapter 5, which starts on page 139, How to Script the DOM with JavaScript. So, develop DOM scripting applications that work with forms and controls, including applications that create and add nodes to the DOM. Describe the use of the DOM or document object model in JavaScript apps. Describe the following properties, node properties of the DOM: node value, parent value, child nodes, first node, first child, last child, and next element sibling. Describe these methods of the document and element interfaces for the DOM. Get elements by tag name, get elements by name, and get elements by class name. Describe these methods of the element interface for the DOM: has attribute, get attribute, set attribute, and remove attribute. Explain how the DOM HTML spec can simplify coding when compared to the DOM core spec. Describe the use of a form submit button and reset button. Describe the use of text box, text area, select, radio, and checkbox objects. Describe these methods for working with forms and controls: submit, reset, focus, and blur. Describe these events for working with controls: on focus, on blur, on click, on double click, on change, on select. Describe the process of creating and adding nodes to the DOM, including rows and cells to the DOM table. All right. So, this chapter is sort of a little, it expands on, I think the last chapter we started talking about the DOM, but this is on DOM scripting. It's not so much on straight JavaScript programming. You really and truly do need to learn this stuff just because of the fact that for you to have all the power that you can possibly have as a web programmer, you need to understand the DOM. So they show here, and this is the top of page 141 in the text, this is the code for a typical kind of web page. So you'll see that this is a doc type right here. But really we have HTML and HTML. That's more or less known as our root node for the DOM. Underneath there we've got a head child and we've got a body child. The head child has a title child inside. That title child has a text child inside. The body child has an H1 tag and a form tag inside, or as direct children. The H1 has a text child. The form has a label child, an input child, and a span child. And the label child, input child, and span child, really just the label and span actually have text childs. So you get this. So the DOM, or document object model, is a hierarchical collection of nodes. Everything that's in here is considered a node, be it an HTML node, a head node, a text node, etc. The DOM for a web page is built automatically as the page is loaded by the web browser. JavaScript can modify the web page in the browser by modifying the DOM. When you change the DOM, or document object model, the web browser immediately displays the results of the change. To modify the DOM, you can use the properties and methods defined in the DOM core spec. Some of those that you will use, the DOM nodes that you'll use most often: the document node, which is the root node of the DOM. It can have only one element as a child node. The element, which is an element on a web page. An element can have text, another element, and comment nodes as child nodes. The ATTR DOM node, which is an attribute of an element. Although it's attached to an element node, it isn't considered a child node. It can have a text node, which is its child node. And you see an example of that right here. Text, which is the text for an element or attribute, and typically that's known as a leaf node because it can't have any children. An interface describes the properties and methods of an object. When you script with a DOM, you often use the properties of the node interface. All right, we're going to go over these in just a second, but in these examples, the $sign calls the function that gets the element that has the ID passed to it as a parameter. We'll look at a text example or a couple in just a minute. So node value, for a text, comment, or attribute node, this property returns the text. Otherwise, it returns a null value. Parent node returns the parent of the current node if one exists. If none exists, it returns null. Child node returns an array of node objects representing the child nodes, the direct descendants of the current node. If this node doesn't have child nodes, the array contains no elements. First child returns a node object for the first child node. If this node doesn't have child nodes, it returns null. Last child returns the last child node. If the node doesn't have child nodes, it returns null. And next element sibling returns a node object for the next sibling. If there aren't any siblings, it again returns null. So we can see, what we will see in some examples here. So this is HTML that contains element nodes and it contains text nodes. All right. These are element nodes because they come, so the form is an element node of the body, so is the H1. The please join our email is a text node of the H1 node, etc. The three methods that are in both what are called the document interface and the element interface are shown here. All three of these methods return arrays. So you can say get elements by tag name. So this will return an array of all element objects from the document or element that have the tag that specifies this. So for instance, if I wanted to return all anchor elements. Get elements by name returns an array of all elements descended from the document or element that have the name attribute that's specified. And get elements by class name returns an array of all element objects descended from the document or element that have the class attribute with a name or names that match whatever you pass to it. Has attribute returns true if the element has the attribute specified in the name. Get attribute returns the value of the attribute specified in the name, or if the name hasn't been set yet, it returns an empty string. Set attribute sets the attribute in the name to the specified value. If the attribute doesn't already exist, it creates the attribute first. And remove attribute removes the attribute specified in the name. So here are some examples that are shown in the middle of page 145. This first one here with the email that you see right here gets the text of an element. All right, that's the node value, okay, of an HTML element with email error as its ID. So go to the first child and get its text. Again, it's possible that this is null. So this gets it because it's on the right-hand side of an equal sign and you're setting it to a variable. This sets it because it's on the left-hand side of an equal sign. Remember, equals means assignment. So this says assign the DOM value to a local variable. This says assign a string to a DOM value. You can also, as it says, set the text of an HTML element without using its ID. So here they show you how to create an array of elements. So again, to use the document.getElements by tag name, this will grab every anchor link on the page and put it into an array called links. All right. This, as it says, will create an array of all LI tags within a UL tag. That being the image list. Notice how to test for and get an attribute. That was that has attribute that we looked at. All right. So we're checking to see if the list has a class. If it does, all right, then we're grabbing all of that information and we're basically getting it and copying it to a local variable. This again is the opposite. We're setting it. Remember, get means that we're retrieving something. Set means literally that. It's kind of like the difference between get is like a select statement and set is like an insert. Not only can we get and set, we can remove things. So the HTML spec provides shortcuts to make it easier for us to work with DOM nodes. The spec is composed of interfaces that inherit properties and methods from other interfaces. For example, the HTML element interface represents a base HTML element. The actual URL for the DOM spec itself is shown right here. These are some properties, as it says, typical properties available. I don't want to read these. You can take a look at them. Notice with all, that means these are available for any kind of element. It would make sense that an href would be available for an anchor tag, that source and alt would be available for an image tag, and that you can disable any input element, etc. So how the DOM spec can simplify your code, you may not agree with this. Some people look at this and, when people do different kinds of programming, some people look at things like this and say, oh my gosh, this looks really hard. I want to do anything but this. But again, getting and setting, which is a lot of the work that you're doing here. Getting and setting. Getting, and in this case, not setting, but disabling. So I know that W3 Schools has a pretty nice tutorial on the DOM. All right, there's the JavaScript HTML Dom. There's an introduction to the DOM. I think that would be a great place to start because it's under developer.mozilla.org. What is the DOM? DOM in JavaScript. How do I access the DOM? Important data types, DOM interfaces. Again, you are not going to become an expert on this. I sure as heck am not. But you are not going to become an expert on this by just sitting there and reading a tutorial or two. But that should get you started. Like I said, there's a nice tutorial on W3 Schools. I've gone through, there's a couple of them, in fact, I've done before. Tutorials Point, I may or may not have mentioned this before, but Tutorials Point is a really nice site. They tend to have really, really nice articles. So if I go in their JavaScript Basics, let's see. Somewhere in here there should be a link where this whole thing you can get as a PDF. Now unfortunately they make it hard because sometimes when you do this, notice it's only 2 pages. That's not what I'd want to show you. So sometimes you have to dig through this to actually get them to show you the PDF of all of this stuff that you see in here. So I'm going to put here tutorials point document object model tutorial. You see it pushes us right back to where we were. But like I said, I'd have to look for it. I'll leave this up and try to look at it later. All right. So again, these are some things you should at least be starting to have some familiarity with. Okay? All right, the FAQ application, it starts on page 148. It says we call this FAQs, frequently asked applications, and you see the user interface, all right, the GUI here you can see on the page. If the user clicks on a heading with a plus sign in it, the text below is displayed. If you click on one with a minus sign in it, the text below it is hidden. The user can display the text below all 3 headings at the same time and go up all the way up to hiding it at the same time. So in other words, if I look at the code for this, remember it's always under source code, book apps, and this is for not 7, this is for Chapter 5. So there's FAQs, bring it up, so I can click here, and here, and here, and have them all open, here, here, and here, and have them all closed. All right? Each of the question is loaded within an anchor element, which is within an H2 element. Each H2 element is followed by a div that contains the answer. The href in the anchor elements are coded with pound signs so they don't go anywhere. When you set up the HTML and the CSS in this way, and you're shown the HTML here, and you're shown the CSS here, all right, all the JavaScript has to do is turn the classes on and off as the user clicks on a heading. So the JavaScript is shown in your book on page 151, and literally, that's it. There's not really a whole heck of a lot. I guess there's the next page too. Not a whole heck of a lot in it. The first two statements in the onload event handler create an array of H2 elements. The for loop in the onload element is executed once for each of the H2 elements. It attaches a toggle event handler to the onClick event of each H2 element. If the code for the toggle event in the code, the this element refers to the H2 element that has been clicked. Now let's try to bring this around a little bit and also talk about forms. All right? I'm going to make this a two-part presentation because I'm only going to go for about 10 minutes or so, and then I'm going to stop. So I'll be somewhere around halfway done. Here's a typical form in a browser. You know, a form contains one or more controls, also known as form fields. There can be text boxes, radio buttons, etc. When you click on a submit button, whose type is submit, and here the example is join our list, the form data is sent to the server as part of an HTTP request. If the form has a reset button on it, and there isn't one here, the form data is set back to its default values. When a form is submitted to a server for processing, the data is sent along with the HTTP request. When you use a GET method, the URL is a query string. So in other words, in the address bar at the top of your page, it contains not only the address, but also all of the sent information, which begins with a question mark and is a set of name-value pairs where each name-value pair is separated by an ampersand. Data validation refers to checking the data collected by a form to make sure it's valid, and complete validation is always done on the server. That said, it makes no sense to send something to a server when you know already that it's bad. So to save round trips to the server, typically you'll do some, most, or all validation also on the client before the data is sent to the server. Okay? But again, it'll always, always, always be repeated on the server. So the form element has three major attributes. The name attribute, which is a name that can be referred to by client-side or server-side code. The action element, which is the URL of the file that will process the form data, where you want to go when the submit button is clicked. And the HTTP method for submitting form data, which can be get or post. Again, get puts the information right in the URL itself, and it's sort of like a select statement for databases in that you can grab the data but not change it. A post is kind of like for a database, an insert, an update, or a delete where you can change the data. So here's an example. This is a get. This is the query string where you're going as join.php. Then there's a question mark and you're passing information. You're passing an email address. That's the field name. The value is grace at, which is shown as an @40, yahoo.com. The first name that is passed, which is another field name, the value is grace. All right, I just mentioned those. So here's some terminology that you should be familiar with. All right, literally a form is an HTML element that typically contains things underneath it that you use to fill in information so you can send it from a client to a server. Those bits of data in the form are known as form controls or form fields. Every form virtually has a submit button on it, which says when you click that form, whatever you put in the action, which is one of your attributes, that's where you want it to go. Reset will set the form back to its default values, and data validation will try to validate the values before they're sent to the server. You typically validate on the client and the server. You must validate on the server. You oftentimes also validate on the client because it doesn't make sense to send information to a server if you know already that it's bad. So, text boxes, text areas, and select objects, they all have a value property. And that's the content of the attribute for the entered text or the entered option. Here's some examples. Notice the value there. So here's using JavaScript code to get the text box, text area, or select list value. And you notice in all cases, it's using the value attribute. So the name and ID attributes of these controls should be set to the same value. After you use the value property of one of the objects to get a string, you can use the length property if you need to get the number of characters in the string. Setting the value of a text box or text area object replaces the contents. Setting the value of a select object selects the object, the one you chose. When the user presses the enter key while typing in a text area, a hard carriage return is put in. And that appears as a character. The new line appears in the value property. On the other hand, when you get to the end of a text box, if you just keep typing, you do a word wrap, and that's a soft carriage return, which does not appear as one of the characters in the value property. Here are some examples of setting or setting. It says here to set those values. Well, here you're setting all of them to the empty string. All right. When you work with radio buttons and checkboxes, they're different, yet they're the same. A radio button is based off the old-fashioned radio buttons that you had in a car. So with a radio button, I might have 3 radio buttons, saying do I want to work full-time, part-time, or either. All right, so I can choose any one of those 3, but I can't choose more than one of those 3. All right, I can also have a checkbox. And really probably the best way to show you these, if I do a file print here, it's not going to show it from here. Let's see, I'll do it from here. So if I do a file print, all right, there's a radio button, which says, do I want to print the entire page, just part of the page, or just certain pages? All right, here is a checkbox. There's only one. So this can be on, which means I want to print this to a file instead of the printer, or it can be off, which means I don't want to do that. This can be on, which means I want to collate, and it doesn't make sense because I don't have enough pages, or it can be off. There's also a checked attribute, as you can see right here. If that's set to true, the button or checkbox is selected. If it's not set, of course, it would be false. All radio buttons in a radio button group have the same name, but they must have different IDs. And only one can be checked at a time. But it's possible that none are checked. But once you check one will always be checked. Checkboxes, on the other hand, are independent of one another and of other checkboxes on the page. They're not treated as a group. The name and IDs should always be the same value. To set a radio button, you set its check property to true. To clear a radio button, you set its check property to false. To set a checkbox, you set its check property to true. To clear it, you set its check property to false. And here are some examples. And this is the associated JavaScript. All right. A couple methods that are oftentimes used with forms. Submit and reset. We already talked about this. Submit submits the form and its data to a server. Reset resets the values in the form to their starting or default values. Two methods that you oftentimes use with form controls are focus. So if form control has the focus, it's the one where the cursor is. When I take the cursor and move it from one form to another form, two things happen. In the first form field that I'm in, the one that I'm leaving, a blur event occurs. When I go into another field and put the cursor in there, a focus event occurs. So focus moves the focus to the control, blur removes the focus from the control. There are associated control events with these. On focus, when the control receives the focus. On blur, when the control loses the focus. On click, when the user clicks the control. On double click, when the user double clicks the control. On change, when the value of the control changes. And on select, when the user selects text in a text box or text area. So not all of these will apply to every single form control. Input elements with a type attribute set to submit or reset will automatically submit or reset the form. When you validate data, regular buttons are often used, so not a form submit button or reset button. And the form may be submitted or reset by using the JavaScript submit or reset method, if or as necessary. Here's a couple examples of using reset and submit. As mentioned, here is an event handler for the on-change event of a select list. Here's one for the double click. Here's one that assigns event handlers to events for the onload event handler. All right, so I'm gonna stop right here and we'll have a part 2. I'm on page 160. This is a nice place to stop. So before we go to this register application, so I'm going to make this a 2-part presentation.